The fog rolls off the Hudson River like a living thing, damp and heavy, clinging to the ancient stone walls that line the perimeter of the estate, a spectral barrier separating the world of mortals from the gods on the hill. It is the golden hour, that fleeting moment where the light strikes the limestone facade of Kykuit and turns the cold rock into something resembling warmth, a trick of the light that photographers love and historians distrust. Standing here, at the iron gates, the silence is absolute, a vacuum of sound that feels manufactured, paid for, and fiercely guarded against the cacophony of the 20th century that raged just beyond the tree line. This is not merely a home. It is a statement of dominance etched into the bedrock of the Picantico Hills, a structure built not just to house a family, but to shield a dynasty from the consequences of its own creation. To understand Kykuit, you must first understand the year 1913, a time when the air in America tasted of coal smoke and rebellion, when the gap between the men who owned the machines and the men who were crushed by them had widened into a canyon of resentment that threatened to swallow the nation whole. In this volatile atmosphere, John D. Rockefeller, a man whose name had become synonymous with the cold, unyielding machinery of capitalism, sought to build a paradise. But paradise, as history teaches us, is often just a fortress with better landscaping. The initial visual impact of the mansion is one of restraint, a curious paradox given the boundless wealth that birthed it. Yet this restraint is a facade, a mask of modesty worn by a monster of industry. The architecture does not scream. It whispers, and that whisper is far more intimidating than a shout because it implies a power so absolute that it has no need for ostentation. As the camera pans over the meticulously manicured lawns, the pristine classical pediments, and the darkened windows that reflect the setting sun, one cannot help but feel the weight of the eyes that once watched from the lookout, the Dutch meaning of the name Kykuit. It was here that the richest man in history retreated when the world decided he was its villain. And it was here that he constructed a reality where he was not a predator, but a patriarch, benevolent and misunderstood. The beauty of the place is undeniable, a symphony of stone and sky, but beneath the beauty lies a foundation of fear. The gates were not just to keep the curious out. They were to keep the rage of a nation at bay. Every stone laid was a brick in a wall of denial, a physical manifestation of the psychological bunker Rockefeller inhabited. This is the story of that bunker, of the forbidden palace where the air is thin, the silence is expensive, and the ghosts of the Gilded Age still pace the halls, waiting for a judgment that money cannot buy. The man at the center of this stone web was a contradiction that defied simple categorization, a specter of a man who seemed to shrink physically even as his shadow grew to cover the globe. John D. Rockefeller in the early 20th century was a figure carved from wax and iron, his hairless head and severe features making him appear alien, a creature evolved solely for the accumulation of capital. To the public, he was the Devil Bill, the anaconda, the ruthless monopolist who had strangled competition and corrupted the very soul of American enterprise. But to himself, he was a humble servant of God, a man who believed with terrifying sincerity that his wealth was a divine gift, a reward for his temperance and discipline. This psychological dissonance is the key to unlocking the secrets of Kykuit. He did not build this estate to flaunt his wealth. He built it to validate his righteousness. In his mind, the disorder of the world, the chaotic screams of labor unions and the scathing ink of muckrakers, was a sinful noise that needed to be shut out so he could hear the voice of the Almighty. The drive to build Kykuit was rooted in a profound insecurity, a desperate need to create a physical space that mirrored the orderly, sanctified interior of his own conscience. He was a man who counted every penny, who famously gave dimes to children and tracked his household expenses with the same fervor he applied to the Standard Oil ledgers. Yet he was about to embark on a construction project that would hemorrhage money in a way that would make a lesser man weep. This tension between his frugality and his vanity is etched into the very blueprints of the house. He wanted a simple home, a comfortable farmhouse where he could eat his crackers and milk in peace. But the gravitational pull of his fortune and the ambitions of his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., demanded a palace. The result is a structure that feels constantly at war with itself, a house that tries to be modest but fails spectacularly, its grandeur leaking out of every cornice and column. It is the architectural embodiment of a man who wants to be a saint but cannot stop being a king. As we delve into the archives, Reading the letters written in his cramped, precise hand, we see not a titan of industry, but a man deeply afraid of the world he had conquered. He was being hunted by the press, by the courts, and by the collective anger of the working class, and he needed a place where the rules of the outside world did not apply. Kykuit was to be his sanctuary, his church, and his prison. The psychological walls were erected long before the stone ones, built from a lifetime of justifying the unjustifiable, of turning a blind eye to the human wreckage left in the wake of Standard Oil. He believed that if he could just build a wall high enough, he could filter out the criticism and live in a pure, distilled reality of his own making. The year the foundation was laid, the world outside the Picantico Hills was catching fire, and the flames were licking at the hem of the Rockefeller empire. The Supreme Court had ordered the dissolution of Standard Oil, shattering the monolith into 34 separate entities, a legal dismemberment that was intended to destroy Rockefeller's power but, in a twist of irony that only high finance can provide, only served to multiply his wealth to astronomical levels. He was now richer than ever, a billionaire in an era where a dollar could buy a day's labor. Yet he was also the most hated man in America. Ida Tarbell's journalism had stripped away the veneer of business acumen to reveal the ruthless predatory tactics beneath, and the public was baying for blood. There were threats of kidnapping, rumors of anarchists with bombs, and a palpable sense that the Rockefeller family was no longer safe in the chaotic streets of New York City or even in their previous summer retreats. The need for Kykuit was not just aesthetic or social. It was existential. They needed a fortress. The decision to build on the hilltop in Tarrytown was strategic, a military maneuver disguised as a retirement plan. The location offered a commanding view of the river and the surrounding countryside, allowing the security forces, an army in their own right, to spot any approaching threat miles before it reached the gates. The transition from their previous residences to this fortified compound marked a turning point in the family's history, a retreat from the public sphere into a private kingdom where they could control every variable. The landscape itself was weaponized, with dense forests planted to screen the house from the road, and winding driveways designed to disorient and slow down any uninvited guests. It was a siege mentality manifested in landscape architecture. The press called it a palace, but the family treated it as a bunker. Every decision, from the height of the fences to the thickness of the walls, was informed by the fear that the mob was coming. This paranoia seeped into the very ground, poisoning the idyllic atmosphere they tried so hard to cultivate. You can feel it in the archival footage of the era, the way the guards scan the horizon, the way the cars move quickly through the gates. The illusion of peace was maintained by a constant, low-level hum of vigilance. They were refugees of their own success, trapped on a hill of their own making, looking down at a world that wanted to tear them apart. The paradox was cruel. The more they spent to isolate themselves, the more they became a target, a mythical dragon on a mountain of gold that every knight and knave in America wanted to slay. The construction of Kykuit was an act of defiance, a declaration that they would not be driven out, that they would build a monument to their endurance that would outlast the rage of the moment. But stone is cold comfort when the world is burning, and no wall is high enough to keep out the knowledge that you are despised. The architectural evolution of Kykuit was a battleground, a proxy war between father and son that played out in blueprints and granite. John D. Rockefeller Sr. wanted a house. John D. Rockefeller Jr., known as Jr., wanted a legacy. Sr., with his Baptist austerity, envisioned a comfortable, unpretentious dwelling, something that spoke of durability and thrift, a place where he could age without the trappings of the aristocracy he privately disdained. Jr., however, bore the burden of the name in a different way. He was the heir, the one who had to navigate the social circles of New York, the one who felt the stinging inadequacy of their previous homes when compared to the Vanderbilts and the Astors. He understood, perhaps better than his father, that in America perception is reality, and if they were to launder the family name from the stain of the oil fields, they needed a stage that projected culture, refinement, and permanence. The initial designs were scrapped, redrawn, and scrapped again as this intergenerational conflict simmered. The architects, Delano and Aldrich, found themselves acting as mediators in a high-stakes domestic dispute, trying to balance the checkbook of the father with the grand ambitions of the son. Junior pushed for the classical revival style, a look that borrowed the visual language of European aristocracy and American democracy, a style that said, "We have always been here," even though the money was barely dry. He wanted stone, not wood. He wanted porticos, terraces, and fountains. Senior grumbled at every expense. His letters filled with passive-aggressive inquiries about the cost of marble and the necessity of so many guest rooms. But Junior was relentless. He saw Kykuit as a tool for rehabilitation. If they could build a place of undeniable beauty, a repository for great art and a masterpiece of landscape design, surely the world would see them not as robber barons, but as enlightened patrons. The design that eventually emerged was a compromise, but one that leaned heavily towards Junior's vision. It was a house that looked like a government building or a museum, stiff and formal, with a facade that refused to smile. The imposing stone structure, with its heavy pediment and rigid symmetry, felt less like a home and more like an institution. It was designed to impress, to intimidate, and to endure. The walls were thick, the windows deep-set, the layout labyrinthine. It was a house built to withstand a siege, both literal and reputational. The struggle over the design left its mark on the house's soul. There is a tension in the architecture, a clash between the desire for simplicity and the necessity of grandeur. It is a house that doesn't quite know what it wants to be, trapped between the frugal prayers of the father and the desperate ambition of the son. Every column stands as a testament to Junior's victory, but the austere lack of frivolous ornamentation speaks to Senior's lingering influence. It is a monument to a family identity crisis, frozen in stone for eternity. If the house was the fortress, the landscape was the moat, a terraformed reality where nature was bent to the will of the checkbook with a ruthlessness that mirrored the monopolization of the oil industry. The transformation of the Picantico Hills was an engineering marvel and an ecological act of violence. Hills were leveled, valleys were filled, and mature trees were moved like chess pieces. John D. Rockefeller did not just want to live in nature. He wanted to own it, to organize it, to make it efficient and pleasing to his eye. The scale of the landscaping project was biblical. Hundreds of laborers, many of them Italian immigrants who spoke no English and lived in camps that were little better than the tenements they had fled, toiled to reshape the earth. They moved massive elms and oaks, root balls and all, using complex pulley systems and steam engines, creating an instant forest where there had been none. It was a godlike assertion of control. If a tree blocked a view, it was moved. If a hill was too steep for the electric cars, it was flattened. The most striking feature was the extensive network of carriage roads, miles of meticulously graded paths that wound through the estate, designed so that Senior could take his daily drives without ever having to leave his property or encounter a member of the public. These roads were his private kingdom, a loop of isolation where he could pretend the world was orderly and serene. Then there was the formal garden, designed by William Wells Bosworth, a Beaux-Arts masterpiece that imposed rigid geometric order onto the wild Hudson Valley landscape. It was a declaration of man's dominance over nature, with fountains, pavilions, and statuary imported from Europe. The Oceanus fountain, a massive replica of a Florentine original, was hauled up the hill at great expense, a symbol of the river god presiding over the oil king's domain. The inclusion of a Japanese garden adds a layer of surrealism to the estate. It was a trend of the time, yes, but in the context of Kykuit, it feels like another acquisition, another culture bought and reconstructed for the amusement of the American Caesar. The golf course, too, was a necessity, a private playground where the rules were always in Rockefeller's favor. The landscape of Kykuit is beautiful, undeniably so, but it is a sterile beauty. It lacks the chaos of true wilderness. Every blade of grass is accounted for, every view is curated. It is a landscape that has been disciplined, beaten into submission, and forced to wear a tuxedo. Standing in the gardens, looking out over the Hudson, one feels the immense power required to curate this view, a power that treats the earth itself as just another subsidiary of Standard Oil. It is a green and golden cage, vast and open, yet hermetically sealed from the messy, organic reality of the world beyond the gates. Step through the heavy bronze doors and the air changes immediately. It becomes still, conditioned, and heavy with the scent of beeswax, old paper, and money. The interior of Kykuit is where the public mask slips and the private neuroses take center stage. While the exterior projects strength and permanence, the interior was designed to be a stage set for a life of cultured refinement that the Rockefellers were desperately trying to inhabit. It is a museum that people happen to sleep in. The furnishings are a collision of eras and styles: English Chippendale, French Louis XV, Chinese ceramics, all of the highest pedigree, all bought with the explicit purpose of proving taste. But there is a coldness to it. The rooms are grand, yes, but they feel unlived in, as if the family were guests in their own home, afraid to disturb the arrangement of the vases. The ceilings are high, adorned with intricate plasterwork, trapping the silence and amplifying the sound of footsteps on the parquet floors. It is a house that demands a hushed tone. The art on the walls in the early days was safe, conventional, the kind of art that wealthy people were supposed to have: old masters, portraits of ancestors, some real, some spiritual, landscapes that mirrored the views outside. But the atmosphere is thick with the tension of the upstairs/downstairs dynamic, magnified to an industrial scale. The house was designed to make the service invisible, yet the sheer size of the operation meant that the family was always surrounded by silent observers. The dining room, with its long mahogany table, was the theater of the family dinner, a ritual that was often as stiff and formal as a board meeting. Senior sat at the head, chewing his food slowly, meticulously, while the rest of the family navigated the minefield of his moods. The library, perhaps the most revealing room, is filled with books that were often bought by the yard to fill shelves, though the family did read. It was a backdrop for the intellectual pretensions of the dynasty. The interior of Kykuit is a study in isolation. The bedrooms are suites, self-contained worlds where family members could retreat from one another. There is no central hearth, no cozy kitchen where everyone congregates. It is a series of beautiful, lonely spaces connected by long, echoing corridors. The house was built to accommodate crowds, to host governors and kings, but when the guests left, the emptiness must have been deafening. It feels like a place where emotions were repressed, where conflicts were buried under layers of velvet and silk. The walls are lined with portraits of stern men and women who seem to be judging the occupants, reminding them of the duty to the name. To live inside Kykuit was to live inside a monument, to be a custodian of one's own legend. It was a gilded cage where the bars were made of gold leaf and the lock was keyed to the stock market. The construction of this palace was not without its disasters, serving as a constant reminder that even the richest man in the world cannot bribe the laws of physics or the inevitability of human error. The cost of Kykuit was astronomical, not just in dollars, which flowed from the Rockefeller coffers like water, but in the psychological toll it took on the family. The project was plagued by delays, revisions, and a perfectionism that bordered on pathology. Junior, in his quest to create the perfect seat for the dynasty, was a demanding taskmaster, obsessing over details that no one else would ever notice. But the true turning point, the moment that foreshadowed the turbulent history of the house, was the fire. Before the house was even fully completed, a fire broke out, damaging the structure and forcing a massive reconstruction. To a superstitious mind, it might have seemed like a judgment, a sign that the devil Bill was not meant to rest easy on this hill. But to the Rockefellers, it was just another engineering problem to be solved with more money and more steel. The rebuilding process was even more rigorous. The house was reinforced, fireproofed, turned into a literal bunker against the elements. They used steel beams, concrete, and stone, eliminating wood wherever possible in the structural elements. This fear of fire, of destruction, speaks to the deeper anxiety of the family. They were building for eternity because they feared their legacy was fragile. The bills kept coming, spiraling higher and higher: labor costs, material costs, the cost of importing entire rooms from Europe. Senior, the man who saved wrapping paper and reused twine, watched the expenses mount with a pained expression, his frugality warring with his desire to please his son. The machine of construction was relentless. It chewed up workers and spat out stone. There were accidents, of course, men maimed or killed in the dangerous work of quarrying and lifting, but these were lines in a ledger, the collateral damage of empire building. The invisible cost was the stress it placed on the father-son relationship. Every change order was a battle, every invoice a skirmish. The house became a symbol of their complex dynamic, the father's guilt-ridden accumulation of wealth and the son's desperate need to spend it to cleanse the name. By the time the house was finally finished, it was already heavy with history, a structure born of conflict, fire, and a bottomless pit of gold. It stood on the hill not just as a home, but as a survivor, a scarred veteran of the war for social acceptance. The perfection of the final product masked the chaos of its birth, much like the Rockefeller public relations machine masked the brutality of Standard Oil. The stone was scrubbed clean, the ashes swept away, and the fortress stood ready to defend its inhabitants, unaware that the real enemy was already inside the gates. Beneath the manicured lawns and the polished floors lay the true foundation of Kykuit, the invisible army of staff and the labyrinth of service tunnels that kept the paradise running. This was the downstairs reality, a subterranean world of labor that was designed to be neither seen nor heard by the masters of the house. The Rockefellers did not just hire servants. They employed a population the size of a small village. Maids, butlers, cooks, chauffeurs, gardeners, stable hands, electricians, and security guards. All were cogs in the great machine of the estate. To ensure that the illusion of magical effortlessness was maintained, a network of tunnels was constructed beneath the grounds. These tunnels allowed delivery trucks to enter and exit without spoiling the view, and allowed staff to move between buildings without being seen by the family or their guests. It was a dehumanizing architectural feature, effectively burying the working class underground so the aristocracy could enjoy their Eden undisturbed. The tunnels were a hive of activity, smelling of diesel, laundry soap, and sweat, a stark contrast to the lavender and beeswax of the main house. Here, the invisible people lived and worked, their lives governed by the strict hierarchy of service. The butler was the king of this underworld, the conduit between the gods above and the workers below. The rules were rigid. Never speak unless spoken to, never be seen in the main hallways unless performing a specific task, and never, ever bring the problems of the outside world into the sanctuary. For the staff, Kykuit was not a home. It was a factory of luxury. They polished the silver, ironed the newspapers, literally, to set the ink so it wouldn't stain the Rockefeller hands, and manicured the gardens with scissors. The psychological weight on the staff was immense. They were serving the most hated man in America, a fact that surely led to complex feelings. Were they accomplices, or just people trying to survive? The estate provided housing, good wages, and stability in a volatile economy, which bought loyalty or at least silence. But the dynamic was feudal. The Rockefellers were the lords of the manor, and the staff were the serfs, bound to the land by the golden handcuffs of employment. This separation of classes was built into the very walls. The service wings were distinct, utilitarian, and hidden behind heavy doors. The split screen of life at Kykuit is striking. Above, JDR sipping milk and looking at the river. Below, a man shoveling coal into a furnace to keep the old man warm. The infrastructure of the estate was a marvel of modern engineering. Private power plants, telephone exchanges, water systems, making Kykuit self-sufficient, a sovereign state within a state. But this independence relied entirely on the sweat of the invisible army. The machine required constant feeding, constant maintenance, and constant silence. It was a gilded sweatshop where the product was the Rockefeller peace of mind. At the center of this swirling vortex of expectation and stone stood John D. Rockefeller Jr., a man crushed by the weight of a name he did not choose and a fortune he did not earn. Jr. is the tragic hero of the Kykuit saga, the dutiful son who sacrificed his own identity to become the steward of his father's legacy. While Sr. was the ruthless conqueror, Jr. was the anxious diplomat, the one tasked with the impossible job of making the world love the Rockefellers. Kykuit was his project, his burden. He oversaw the construction, the furnishing, and the landscaping, pouring his soul into the estate in a desperate bid for his father's approval. Approval that was given sparingly, if at all. Senior loved his son, but he was a hard man, critical and demanding, and Junior lived in a constant state of fear that he would fail the patriarch. This anxiety permeated the house. Junior was a man of deep religious conviction. Much like his father, But he was also plagued by migraines and nervous exhaustion. The pressure of managing the family's philanthropic transition, the creation of the Rockefeller Foundation, the charitable giving, while simultaneously building this palace was immense. He raised his own children, the famous brothers, in this environment of high stakes and high walls. He wanted them to be normal, to be moral, to be humble, yet he raised them in a castle. The contradiction must have been maddening. He taught them to track their allowance to the penny while they played in gardens that cost millions. He read them the Bible in a room filled with looted European treasures. Junior's presence in the house was one of quiet desperation. He was the bridge between the robber baron past and the philanthropic future, and the strain of holding those two worlds together nearly broke him. He was the enabler of the fantasy, the one who ensured that the old man was comfortable and shielded from the harsh truths of his reputation. He managed the staff, the security, the finances, and the public relations, all while trying to be a good father and a good Christian. Kykuit was his masterpiece, but it was also his cross to bear. He walked the halls checking for dust, checking the accounts, checking the locks, always checking. He was the caretaker of the fortress, the warden of the dynasty. His struggle is palpable in the archives, in the letters where he agonizes over the cost of a fence or the placement of a statue. He wanted Kykuit to be perfect because he felt that he, himself, was flawed. If the house was perfect, if the gardens were flawless, perhaps the world would forgive them. Perhaps his father would be proud. It was a heavy burden for one man, and the stones of Kykuit are cemented with his sweat and his anxiety. The shadows stretching across the lawns of Kykuit in 1914 were not just from the trees. They were cast by the events in Ludlow, Colorado. The Ludlow Massacre, where striking miners and their families were killed by the National Guard and camp guards at a Rockefeller-owned mine, sent shockwaves all the way to the Picantico Hills. It was the turning point that transformed Kykuit from a private retreat into a necessary bunker. The public rage was no longer just rhetorical. It was physical. Protesters marched in New York, anarchist plots were whispered in the back alleys, and the name Rockefeller became a curse word. The impact on life at Kykuit was immediate and chilling. The security, already tight, was tightened further. The gates were reinforced, the guards doubled. The estate became a true fortress, an island of fear in a sea of hostility. Junior was called to testify before Congress, dragged from his sanctuary to answer for the blood on the family's hands. The contrast was jarring. The quiet, refined atmosphere of the library at Kykuit versus the screams of dying women and children in a tent colony in Colorado. The massacre haunted the house. It was the elephant in the room that no one spoke of, yet everyone felt. The psychological bunker hardened. The family withdrew further into themselves. They could not go out without protection. They could not open a newspaper without seeing themselves depicted as murderers. Kykuit became their only safe space, but it was a safety bought with blood. The isolation intensified. The children were kept close, their worlds shrinking to the boundaries of the estate. The fear of kidnapping was real and constant. The guards patrolling the perimeter were not just ornaments. They were armed men expecting an assault. This siege mentality shaped the family's interaction with the outside world for decades. It birthed the modern field of public relations, as Ivy Lee was hired to spin the narrative, to turn the monsters into benefactors. But inside the house, the spin didn't matter. They knew they were hated. The silence of the estate became heavy, oppressive. It was the silence of a family under indictment. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like an accusation. The view of the Hudson was no longer a symbol of dominion. It was a lookout post for approaching danger. The turning point of Ludlow proved that no amount of money could buy immunity from the consequences of greed. The house, beautiful as it was, became a golden prison, and the inmates were the richest family on earth, serving a life sentence of suspicion and fear. In this masculine world of oil, stone, and finance, the women of Kykuit were the softening agents, the curators of the domestic soul that kept the house from becoming completely sterile. While Laura Spellman Rockefeller, JDR's wife, died before the house was fully realized as the palace it became, her spirit of piety and temperance hung over the initial designs. But it was Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, Jr.'s wife, who truly breathed life into the cold stone lungs of the mansion. She was a woman of culture, warmth, and progressive vision, a stark contrast to the rigid conservatism of the Rockefeller men. She moved into the fortress and tried to make it a home. She brought in color, she brought in modern art, planting the seeds for the Museum of Modern Art, and she brought a sense of humanity to the upbringing of the children. Abby operated in the enabler role but also as a subversive force. She navigated the treacherous waters between her husband's anxieties and her father-in-law's eccentricities with grace. She was the one who could smooth over the conflicts, who could make the staff feel seen, who could host a dinner party that felt less like an inquisition and more like a gathering. Her influence is seen in the gardens, particularly the eyebrow garden, and in the softening of the interior decor over the years. But it was a difficult existence. She was trapped in the upstairs cage, expected to perform the role of the perfect society wife while living in a high-security compound. She had to balance the demands of raising 5 high-energy sons and 1 daughter in an environment that was fundamentally abnormal. How do you teach a child empathy when they live in a castle guarded by men with guns? Abby tried. She encouraged the children to give to charity, to understand the value of $1, but the reality of their privilege was inescapable. The domestic sphere was her domain, but it was a domain under siege. She had to manage the emotional climate of the house, absorbing the stress of her husband and the judgment of the public. She was the buffer. Without her, Kykuit might have become a mausoleum of cold ambition. She injected art, laughter, and a touch of chaos into the orderly world of the Rockefellers. Yet, even she could not fully dispel the gloom. The weight of the house, the weight of the name, pressed down on her too. She was the bird in the gilded cage who sang to keep the others from losing their minds. Her legacy is woven into the rugs and the paintings, a subtle thread of warmth in a tapestry of power. As the years ground on, the daily life of John D. Rockefeller Sr. at Kykuit settled into a bizarre ritual of health obsessions and extreme isolation. The Devil Bill was determined to live to be 100, and he treated his body with the same ruthless efficiency he had applied to the oil market. His routine was clockwork. He woke at a specific time, ate specific foods, often milk and crackers, chewed excessively to aid digestion, played a specific number of holes of golf, and napped at specific intervals. The richest man in the world lived like a monk in a palace. The contrast was jarring. He would sit on the terrace, wrapped in blankets, looking like a frail, ancient bird, surrounded by the opulence of a Roman emperor. He had no hair, his face was a mask of wrinkles, but his eyes were still sharp, still calculating. He distributed dimes to guests and staff, a rehearsed performance of benevolence that became his trademark. But the loneliness was palpable. He was a man who had outlived his contemporaries, outlived his enemies, and was now just waiting for the final merger with the infinite. The house catered to his every whim. The temperature was controlled, the noise was minimized, the car was brought around at the exact second he required it. He was the sun around which the entire estate orbited, yet he generated no warmth. His interactions with his grandchildren were formal, distant. He was a myth to them, a living statue. The machine of Kykuit was now a life support system for one old man. The staff moved like ghosts, terrified of disturbing his routine. The silence of the library, the hush of the dining room. It was all for him. He read the Bible, he read the stock reports, and he watched the river. Did he feel guilt? Did he think about the miners in Colorado or the competitors he had crushed? The archives are silent on his internal monologue, but the architecture speaks for him. He built a wall to keep the world out, and in doing so, he locked himself in with his memories. The daily rituals were a way to impose order on the chaos of aging, a way to pretend he was still in control. But as he withered, the house seemed to grow larger, emptier. The Forbidden Palace was a lonely place to die. It was a golden waiting room. The gluttony of the architecture mocked the asceticism of the man. He owned everything, yet could enjoy almost nothing. It is the ultimate tragic irony of the Gilded Age. The man who won the game of capitalism ended up alone on a hill, eating crackers and hiding from the world he owned. When John D. Rockefeller Sr. finally died in 1937, Just shy of his 100th birthday goal, a seismic shift occurred within the walls of Kykuit. The king was dead. Long live the junior. The passing of the torch was not just a legal transfer of deeds. It was a psychological release. The heavy, pious, oppressive atmosphere of the founder began to dissipate, replaced by the slightly more modern, albeit still anxious, energy of his son. But Junior was already an old man himself by then. The real energy began to shift toward the third generation, the famous brothers. John III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David. The funeral was a private affair, of course, the gates locked tight. The world watched from a distance, the hatred having softened into a sort of begrudging fascination with the sheer longevity of the man. With the patriarch gone, Kykuit ceased to be a bunker for a robber baron and began its transformation into a dynastic seat of power. The ghost of the old man still lingered. His wig stands, his favorite chairs, but the fear of imminent attack lessened. The fortress aspect remained, but the purpose changed. It was no longer about hiding. It was about projecting. The estate became the gathering place for the clan, a place where the brothers would meet to discuss the family business, philanthropy, and their own political ambitions. The transition was physical too. Rooms were repurposed, the gloom was lifted slightly, but the shadow of the founder was long. Junior, ever the steward, maintained the house as a shrine to his father's memory, ensuring that the values of the Rockefellers were preserved. This meant that for a time, the house remained stuck in 1913, a time capsule of the pre-war era. The staff still wore the same uniforms. The rituals of dinner remained. But the turning point had occurred. The creator was gone. The machine was now running on momentum. The turning point was the realization that the house was no longer just a home for one man's ego, but a headquarters for a global influence operation. The transition was subtle, a slow exhale after decades of holding their breath. The Forbidden Palace was about to open its doors, just a crack, to the ambitions of the grandsons who wanted to rule the world, not just own it. The third generation, the brothers, grew up running through the halls of Kykuit, playing hide and seek in the tunnels, and learning to swim in the fountains. To them, this fortress was just Grandpa's house, albeit a house where the guards carried guns and the guests were prime ministers. But as they matured, the house shaped them. It taught them that they were different, that they were set apart from the rest of humanity by a barrier of stone and gold. It instilled in them a sense of noblesse oblige, the obligation of the nobility to be generous, but also a profound sense of entitlement. They were the princes of this American kingdom. Nelson Rockefeller, in particular, saw Kykuit not as a burden, but as a stage. He was the dominant personality, the one who most resembled his grandfather in ambition, if not in temperament. He loved the house. He loved the power it represented. While his brothers drifted to other estates or interests, Nelson set his sights on Kykuit as his future base of operations. He saw the potential of the place to be a tool for his political career. The house, which had been a symbol of corporate greed, would become a symbol of political power. The brothers' dynamic played out in the rooms of the mansion. The rivalries, the alliances, the debates over the direction of the family philanthropy, it all happened here. They were a dynasty under siege not by the public anymore, but by their own expectations. They had to be good Rockefellers. They had to justify their existence. Kykuit was the crucible where this identity was forged. The walls heard the arguments about modern art, about politics, about the future of the Chase Manhattan Bank. The machine of the estate adapted to serve 5 masters instead of 1. The garage filled with sports cars. The tennis courts saw more action. The gloomy atmosphere was pierced by the energy of the mid-20th century. But the isolation remained. They were still trapped in the bubble. They brought their friends, their wives, their advisors into the bubble, but it was still a bubble. The view from the porch was still a view of a world they floated above, never truly touching. The house taught them that they were the directors of the play, and the rest of the world was just the audience. This psychological conditioning, bred within the limestone walls, would shape American politics and finance for the next 50 years. The most radical transformation of Kykuit came at the hands of Nelson Rockefeller. If Junior tried to make the house a museum of the past, Nelson turned it into a gallery of the future. He was a voracious collector of modern art, a passion he inherited from his mother but took to extreme levels. He didn't just hang paintings, he invaded the house with them. He took the basement, the tunnels, the bowling alley, spaces that were once utilitarian or recreational, and turned them into a subterranean art gallery that rivaled the best museums in New York. Picasso, tapestry reproductions of Guernica, Giacometti sculptures, Calder mobiles, the avant-garde crashed into the Beaux-Arts. It was a visual shock. Imagine walking through a pristine 1913 classical mansion, descending a staircase, and finding yourself surrounded by abstract expressionism and cubist nightmares. This was Nelson's stamp. It was an assertion of his own identity, a rebellion against the stuffy, pious history of the house. He placed massive modern sculptures in the gardens, juxtaposing twisted steel against the manicured hedges and classical urns. It was a clash of eras. The house became a dialogue between the robber baron past and the modernist future. Nelson used the art to intimidate and impress. When he hosted political leaders, he would tour them through the galleries, using the art as a conversation starter, a power move. "You don't understand this Picasso? Let me explain it to you." It was soft power weaponized. The art invasion changed the energy of Kykuit. It became less funereal, more chaotic, more alive. But it also highlighted the disconnect. The art was about revolution, about breaking forms, yet it was housed in the ultimate symbol of the establishment. The irony was likely lost on Nelson, or perhaps he enjoyed it. The basement galleries were a maze of color and form, a psychological dungeon converted into a playground for the intellect. It was here that the Forbidden Palace became truly unique, a place where a 19th-century oil monopoly housed 20th-century artistic radicalism. The walls that once protected JDR from anarchists now held the art of artists who sympathized with them. The building had become a container for contradictions, holding them in a delicate, expensive balance. As Nelson rose in political power, eventually becoming governor of New York and then vice president of the United States, Kykuit evolved into a shadow White House. The fortress opened its gates to the elite of the world. It was no longer a bunker against the public. It was a VIP lounge for the global power structure. The Shah of Iran, Henry Kissinger, presidents, and kings, they all came to Picantico. The driveway that was once a defensive perimeter became a red carpet. The external world enters, but only on invitation. These visits were choreographed spectacles. The guests would be flown in by helicopter, landing on the lawns, treated to the finest food, the best wine, and the view of the Hudson. Kykuit was used to seduce, to negotiate, to impress. It was a tool of statecraft. The isolation of the estate was now its greatest asset. Here, away from the press corps in Washington, deals could be cut in private. The room where it happened was often the library at Kykuit or the golf course. The house projected an image of stability and American continuity. "Look at this," the stones said. "We are solid. We are rich. We are in charge." Nelson reveled in this. He was the lord of the manor, using his grandfather's fortress to secure his own political legacy. But this era also marked the beginning of the end for the house as a private home. It was becoming a quasi-public institution, a venue. The intimacy was gone. The security was now Secret Service, not just private guards. The dynasty under siege narrative had flipped. They were now the ones besieging the world with their influence. Yet, the ghost of the public rage remained. When Nelson was VP, there were protests outside the gates. The Rockefeller name still carried the weight of suspicion. The fortress was still necessary. The turning point here was the realization that the house was too big, too important, and too expensive to be just a family home. It belonged to history now. The family was just living in the museum exhibits. The soft power era was the final glory days of Kykuit as a residence, a last hurrah of Gilded Age splendor used for Cold War politics. The house shone brightly, illuminated by the flashbulbs of official photographers, masking the rot of age that was beginning to set in. By the late 20th century, the machine was sputtering. The cost of maintaining a private palace in modern America was becoming prohibitive, even for the Rockefellers. The taxes, the staff salaries, the heating bills, the constant repairs to the stone and the roof, it was a financial black hole. The family, now in its fourth and fifth generations, had sprawled. The fortune was diluted. Not everyone was a billionaire. The legacy phase began with a difficult conversation. What do we do with this dinosaur? The house that was built to last forever was becoming a burden. It was a white elephant made of limestone. The decay was not just physical. It was existential. The era of the great country estates was over. No one lived like this anymore. It was an anachronism. The family had to face the reality that they could not keep Kykuit private forever. The decision to hand the estate over to the National Trust for Historic Preservation was a surrender, an admission that the fortress could no longer be held. It was also a tax strategy, a final act of financial wizardry. But it meant the end of the Forbidden Palace. The public, the very mob that JDR had built the walls to keep out, was going to be invited in. The transition was painful. It meant cataloging every item, assessing every room, turning a home into a tourist attraction. The decay was arrested by preservationists, but the life of the house was extinguished. The smells of cooking, the sounds of children, the secret whispers in the hallways, replaced by tour guides and velvet ropes. The estate was frozen in time, sanitized for public consumption. The legacy of Kykuit became one of education, not exclusion. But the cost of this transition was the loss of the mystery. The dark story was now a script recited to visitors. The psychological bunker was thrown open, and the sunlight disinfected the ghosts. Or did it? The maintenance of the estate is now a public trust, a collective effort to remember a time when one man could own the horizon. The decay is kept at bay, but the spirit of the place, the fear, the ambition, the hubris, is trapped under glass, inspected daily by the descendants of the people who once wanted to burn it down. Walking the halls of Kykuit today, after the last tour bus has left, the silence returns, and with it, the ghosts. They are not the sheet-wearing kind. They are the heavy, lingering impressions of the personalities that shaped this pile of rock. You can feel JDR in the lookout, his presence a cold draft of air, still watching the river, still counting the ships. You can feel Junior in the library, the anxiety of the dutiful son vibrating in the woodwork. You can feel Nelson in the basement, a chaotic energy that refuses to settle. The house is a memory palace. Every room tells a story of power and its price. The ghosts are the echoes of the conversations that happened here, the plotting, the praying, the bargaining. The walls refuse to speak, but they remember. The legacy of Kykuit is not just the architecture or the art. It is the psychological residue of a family that lived in the eye of the storm. The emptiness of the house at night is profound. It is the loneliness of extreme wealth made physical. The furniture sits ready for guests who will never arrive. The table is set for a dinner that ended 50 years ago. To walk these halls is to intrude on a private grief, a private glory. The forbidden nature of the place still hangs in the air, despite the open doors. You feel like you shouldn't be there, like you are trespassing in the mind of a man who wanted to be alone. The preservation has kept the structure, but it hasn't exorcised the mood. It is still a somber place, a place where the air is thin. The ghosts of Kykuit are not just the Rockefellers. They are the ghosts of the American dream, the ruthless ambition, the desire for control, and the ultimate realization that you cannot take it with you. The house stands as a tomb for an era, a mausoleum for the idea that money can buy peace. The invisible army is gone, replaced by security sensors, but the machine still hums, a low-frequency vibration of history that chills the bone. Stand on the porch one last time. Look out over the Hudson Valley. The view is spectacular, a sweeping panorama of river and hill, of light and shadow. It is the view of a god. This is what they bought. This is what they defended. But look closer. The view is framed by stone columns, filtered through the lens of ownership. The view from the porch is the final lesson of Kykuit. It is a lesson in perspective. From here, the world looks small, manageable, orderly. The messy realities of life, poverty, war, struggle, are reduced to scenery. This was the drug that Kykuit offered its inhabitants. The illusion of control. It was a dangerous drug. It isolated them, warped their view of reality, and trapped them in a golden bubble. The gilded gloom is most palpable here. You are surrounded by beauty, but you are utterly alone. The wind blows up from the river, carrying the sounds of the modern world. A train whistle, a siren, the hum of the highway. The fortress failed. The world moved on. The Rockefellers are just names on a plaque now, their power diffused, their monopoly broken by time if not by law. The house remains, a beautiful, stubborn corpse of the Gilded Age. The legacy is a warning. It tells us that you can build a palace, you can move mountains, you can buy the finest art in the world, but you cannot build a wall high enough to keep out your own humanity. The Forbidden Palace was never really about keeping the public out. It was about keeping the reality in. It was a cage for the conscience. As the sun sets, the house turns dark, a silhouette against the dying light. It looks like a fortress again, brooding and silent. The tour is over. The gates are closing. The dark story of Kykuit is not about the bad things that happened there. It is about the tragic futility of the attempt to escape the human condition through architecture. In the end, Kykuit is a paradox carved in stone. It is a monument to success that served as a prison for the successful. It is a house built on the foundation of the most ruthless capitalism the world has ever seen, yet it houses some of the most delicate art ever created. It is a place of deep religious piety and extravagant material excess. The conclusion of our investigation brings us back to the central question. Was it worth it? Was the hatred, the fear, the isolation worth the view? The house offers no answer. It simply exists, a mute witness to the rise and fall of an American dynasty. It teaches us about the hubris of the wealthy, the desire to leave a mark that will outlast death. But it also teaches us about the fragility of that desire. Stone crumbles, gold tarnishes, and names are forgotten. Kykuit stands as a beautiful, terrifying reminder of the limits of power. It is a forbidden palace not because we cannot enter, but because we cannot truly understand what it felt like to live inside that level of isolation. It remains a psychological bunker, a testament to the fact that the richest man in the world was also, in many ways, the poorest. He had everything, and yet he had to hide behind a wall. The story of Kykuit is the story of America. Ambitious, beautiful, cruel, and haunted. As we leave the estate, driving down the winding roads that were built to confuse us, we return to the real world, the noisy, messy, chaotic world. And looking back at the hill, at the stone tower rising above the trees, we might feel a twinge of envy for the beauty, but mostly we feel relief. Relief that we are on this side of the gate. Relief that we are not trapped in the gilded gloom of the Rockefeller dream. The house sleeps now, a museum of its own history, waiting for the fog to roll in off the Hudson and swallow it whole once again. The dark story is finished, but the silence of Kykuit echoes on. A whisper of vanity, vanity. All is vanity, drifting down from the Picantico hills.